Round one of the NHL draft is in the books. The Leafs went way off the board with their selection, but it might be the smart play. I'll explain why that could be on today's edition of the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day.
You're Locked On Maple Leafs, your daily podcast on the Toronto Maple Leafs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Leafs podcast, a daily Maple Leaf-centric podcast hosted by myself, Mike DiStefano, and my co-host, Dave Morassutti. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. A championship team is about each other being a perfect fit. Same with their vehicles, so for parts that fit, head to eBay Motors and look for the green check. Stay in the game with eBay Guaranteed Fit. ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, Dave, the first round of the 2023 NHL Draft is in the books. We'll kind of dive into the rest of the draft in just a moment, a little later on today's show. But all around, for the first time since 2007, no trades took place in the first round of the draft. It just, all right, keep it moving, pick after pick after pick after pick after pick. We didn't see a single draft day deal or draft floor deal take place in the first round. Maybe we'll see a little bit more stuff happen tomorrow. But like, how surprising was that there wasn't a single deal that ended up getting done to the first 32 picks of this draft?
Yeah, I was surprised. It made for a little bit of a boring draft, in my opinion. I always like at least some inkling that deals were happening. We had every time the one of the Canadian GMs was up speaking to Elliot Friedman, and Elliot Friedman just like, was there a deal in the works? Anything close? No. I'm like, couldn't even just lie to us saying a few conversations may have been close on something. Nope, just flat out no.
Apparently the Preds did try really hard, they said, to get into the top four of the draft. They wanted to get into the top four, make a splash, and just were unable to do so. Nobody was coming to terms on, what was the correct, trade package, and thus nothing happens. Even, we saw our guy was on the phone there as the Leafs pick was coming up, when they went to break, I think it was right ahead of their pick. He was on the phone. He was taking calls, and ultimately nothing was done. They did stick and pick, and the selection that the Toronto Maple Leafs made was Easton Cowan of the London Knights. Projects as middle six centerman in the NHL. What was your initial reaction to the pick? And after you did some, diligent research since learning of this selection, you feel any different, or you still kind of sitting there scratching your head like a lot of people have been?
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out where this kind of came from, right? Because every single mock draft I read, prospect ranking, especially Bob McKenzie's list, didn't have him within like the first 40. So I was just
nowhere to be seen on a lot of these picks.
Like I was on talking with the guys over at Locked On doing our quick reaction of the clip, but I said it was one of those where he wasn't even among the first few rows of prospects. They had him so high up. That tells you that he wasn't really expected to be selected in that range. And so I think you have to kind of in those moments, you kind of have to say your eyebrow raises, and then you go, okay, why exactly was this the pick? And so doing some research, reading what a lot of the analysis and reaction to it, to me, my reaction now is I don't hate the player. I actually do like the player. I just am puzzled by where he was picked, just because I don't think he's a guy that you would have to worry about being picked in the first round or even maybe in the mid-second round. Maybe he goes later. I guess this is where my thought process was maybe the Leafs just felt like we're not able to trade down, because I think that's probably what Treliving was looking to do.
Yeah.
So we might as well just pick the guy because we don't have another pick, right, for the next little bit. So at first, I wanted to make the joke that maybe Brad Chillian was trying to make a reservation over at Tootsie's. That's why he was on the phone, because they got a nice little shout out from on the draft floor there. But
Billy
I
Gare.
yeah, good old Billy Guerin trying to make it somewhat interesting, that NHL draft. But you know, like I just reading what people have been saying, like there weren't a lot of bad things being said about Easton Cowan, like nothing really, like we're to the point where I'm just like really concerned. It's just nobody said that there was enough for him to making it into a first round pick. Maybe some of the stuff that he did, and later in the season, if he did that all year long, maybe that would have gotten him into that conversation. But nothing he did all year long screamed first round pick. So I can understand why people are reacting the way they are. But I also think if the Leafs were going to be making this pick, this wasn't going to be a player that was going to be playing for the team next year, and maybe not even the year after that. Like late first round picks take time to develop, and if you do it the right way, those are the ones that tend to somewhat work out well if you're willing to be patient. So this is clearly a pick that a lot of people, like if I'm the Leafs, you got to really hold the expectation of being patient and letting all the tools develop here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good way to put it here, where you don't hate the player, but you just feel like it was a little too early. Like I've reached
Mm.
out to a bunch of scouts and former players, and a lot of these guys are kind of echoing the similar sentiments. Where they're like, "I like the player. I think that he's going to be a good NHLer, but he is a little bit early." Like I was just messaging Scott Wheeler, a draft prospect analyst from the Athletic, and I said, "Hey, what are your thoughts on the trade?" And that's pretty much what he said was, "Yeah, it's a little bit early. He was definitely the lowest guy on his board that was selected in the first round." And it appears that when you look at the consolidated rankings with all of the top, draft boards that were out there, including, Button, the Hockey News, you look at the Athletic, Bob McKenzie, all of these boards, he was the consolidated 70th prospect in the rankings. He was as high as 34th by Craig Button, but he was the only one who had him as a top 50 prospect. Everyone else had him as a second, third round player, pretty much. And he ends up going at the end of the first round there at pick 28. It's a big gamble, I think, by the Toronto Maple Leafs. It certainly was. I do wonder, like when they sat there and they're seeing these picks kind of come right up to them, and they saw once they got to pick 25, thinking, okay, Musty still on the board. You've got
Yeah.
Callum Ritchie, who still could be on the board. Two bigger bodies, tenacious players. Potentially they were looking at those two, and then they went pick 26 and pick 27, and they sat there. And you're right. We saw the phone that was ringing. He was on the phone, and
Mhm.
at first I thought maybe someone's trading, coming to trade into that selection. Maybe it was more likely that he was calling around trying to trade out, and no one
Mhm.
was willing to bite. And so they stuck, and they picked the guy, and they went with Easton Cowan as the selection. From everyone that I spoke to, it sounds as though this guy's just got a really high motor. Like this dude is just an energizer bunny type of player. Like almost kind of like a Zach Hyman, but he plays down the middle. So one, you know, I saw Craig Button saying that if he reaches his potential, he could be like a Chandler Stevenson type of player, which is a really good player. Like Chandler
Yeah.
Stevenson, great centerman for the Stanley Cup champion Vegas Golden Knights. But worst case scenario is a third line center. He's a two-way guy, dependable, playmaking, very speedy, tenacious, really good defensive instincts is what I'm reading as well. High hockey IQ. So there's some upside there and some intrigue if he reaches that potential, but he's a little undersized at 5'10", 170 pounds. And there's obviously always going to be some question marks on players who are a little undersized who do well in the OHL and do well in juniors, but can they do it against men? Can they do it against grown men? And what we just happened to see in the Stanley Cup final this year was it was a big man's game. You look at the Cup champs, and they've got a lot of big players, and it's a heavy playoff style of hockey. once you get to the playoffs. And does he play that way? His play style lends him to look more to play that way, but his size does not. So it'll be interesting to see if he can fill out a little bit, if he can put on a little bit more weight, and potentially that's not going to be a problem. A la a Chandler Stevenson, or even like a Braden Point, who's a very undersized player, but is so tenacious and he's quick and he's a good, great hockey player. The size doesn't matter for him. Maybe he can kind of grow into that. From everything else that I saw too was, and this is big. This is where I look at Wes Clark, and we'll hear from Wes Clark at some point in the next 24 hours. We'll definitely be able to relay some of what the Leafs brass had to say about this pick, and we'll learn a little bit more and understand it. But what I've gleaned from the way that Wes Clark has run the show for the last couple of years, and the Leafs in general, it's they really put a lot of stock into what have you shown me lately.
Yes.
Because if you look at what happened with the Matthew Nyes pick a couple of years ago, it was a really strong back half of the playoffs, or back half of the season and playoffs, that they saw that they really liked Matthew Nyes enough to take him with a second round pick. Very similar with Nick Moldenauer last year. It was a strong back half that he had as a third round pick that they took. And I believe it was the exact same with Fraser Minton, who had a really good, strong second half after an injury. So they do look at, what have you done for me lately? What has the development been in the last 6 months? Has he taken steps? And if he continues to take steps that way and that progression keeps going, what can he be? So it's kind of a projection pick, and they saw a lot of steps forward that Easton Cowan took in the final couple of months of the season, and it really culminated into a breakout in the playoffs. That's a really encouraging thing to hear if you are a Maple Leafs fan, is that this guy stepped up big at the biggest moment in time, and that was in the playoffs. Through the regular season, he had 20 goals, 53 points in 66 games. The playoffs rolled around, 9 goals, 12 assists, 21 points in 20 games, and was, according to Carlo Koliakovo, TSN hockey analyst, buddy of mine, former colleague, he told me, or I saw he was tweeting about this, that he was London's best player in the OHL final. I got a message also from a couple other scouts that I reached out to, and they said the playoffs are really what rocketed this guy up the boards. It must have been what the Maple Leafs fell in love with, and we know that the pipeline with the Hunters over in London, it's a good program, and if they gave strong marks to Brad Treliving, Wes Clark, Shanny, anybody who was involved asking questions, that there was definitely a good recommendation. So I think that there's intrigue with this pick. Was it a little bit high, perhaps? But the Leafs don't select again until pick number, what is it, 153? He wasn't going to be there at pick 153. Like, that
Nope.
guy probably would have been taken somewhere in the mid to late second round. It sounds like, and they didn't have a second round pick, so they decided to stick and pick, and they end up going with Easton Cowan. So we'll see what he ends up becoming. Some of the strengths that I've read, again, high motor energy guy, two-way playmaking center. He's got really high IQ, good vision, great defensive instincts. Size that was a little bit of a concern, but if he can, he's been able to get through all of those weaknesses, I suppose, in the OHL. If he can find a way to also adapt it into the NHL, maybe this is a good pick. He was one of those late risers. No one thought he'd rise all the way into the first round, but maybe 5 years from now, we're sitting here thinking, man, that was a good pick by the Toronto Maple Leafs. And hey, they've got a good track record of late of scouting some talent later in drafts, second, third, fourth rounds, and being able to have those people really turn into some good talented prospects. Obviously, Nick Robertson, we're thinking Moldenauer, Grebyankin last year was a fifth round pick. He looks like he's going to be a really good player. Obviously, Matthew Nyes, a second round pick. So there's a strong history of this Leafs team and the scouting staff that still remains from when Dubas was here with Wes Clark and company. So no, I think that they've earned a little bit of a benefit of the doubt here with this selection. I'm not going to sit here and say that it was terrible. Like, were there players on the board who I thought, were better and higher on my board or on the boards? Yeah, absolutely. I think I would have been, better off if they would have taken like a Riley Haight or Gauthier potentially. Who's another one that I saw? Andrew Cristal. Like, there's a few players that I had pegged as a really good selection when they were on the clock. They went in a different direction. We'll see how that turns out for the Toronto Maple Leafs. I'm sure they like the pick, and we'll hear more from them obviously in due time. I'll say this though. He will always be kind of linked to Rasmus Sandin, right? This was the pick that they traded Rasmus Sandin for. So there has to be expectation that he has to turn out to be a better player than Sandin turns out to be, or else there'll always kind of be question marks on that trade. Although that was a Kyle Dubas trade, not a Brad Treliving, but there will still be a little bit of a connection with those two players. I do want to say that. Anything else that you want to say about good old Easton Cowan before we move on and chat about the rest of the draft?
Well, he did get a FaceTime from Mitch Marner, so the London Knights connection is growing strong. So
Yeah,
Leafs are keeping that connection alive for sure.
absolutely they are. So Easton Cowan, the newest Toronto Maple Leaf. We'll see what he's got. I'm sure the projection is he won't be ready to go in the NHL next season. Maybe not the season after that, but in the next few years, I would imagine that Easton Cowan will make his way into a Maple Leafs lineup, and then we'll really see what this kid's all about. Is the motor there that they talked about? Is the IQ, the vision, a little bit of scoring touch, the playmaking? We'll see how he develops and if he can develop into a first round talent like they're projecting, and kind of rolling the dice and thinking that he could be a little bit of a dark horse pick for them. So we'll see how that turns out. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, let's recap the rest of the first round. Couple of surprises throughout the draft. No trades, but there were some surprises. We'll chat about those in just a minute. And the Maple Leafs made a couple of signings today as well, bringing back a couple of players. We'll tell you who they are and our thoughts on the deal in a little bit. But Dave, how about a word from our show sponsor?
Yes, today's episode is brought to you by AG1 by Athletic Greens. Keeping up with proper nutrition is really hard. You're busy, you're stuck at your desk, you're eating whatever you can to get you through the day. But what if you could start your day with the ultimate daily nutritional insurance? With a single scoop of AG1 and a glass of water, you can do just that and absorb 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, adaptogens to help start your day right. Athletic Greens was created when the founder experienced a ton of gut health issues and ended up on a complicated supplement routine to recover. It cost him $100 a day, which just isn't sustainable. He created Athletic Greens after experiencing just how difficult it was to create an optimal nutrition routine on your own, all for around $3 a day. So, if a comprehensive solution is what you need for your supplement routine, then try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/NHL network. That's drinkag1.com/NHL network. Check it out today.
Welcome back into the Locked On Leafs podcast. I'm Mike DiStefano with my co-host Dave Morassutti. We are a daily Maple Leaf-centric podcast. You can find us wherever you find your podcast or also up on YouTube. We will continue to break things down, not only with the Maple Leafs, but around the NHL throughout the summer. So make sure that you're subscribed to Locked On Leafs for that daily Leafs and hockey fix that hits right into the veins. We'll give it to you right here on the Locked On Leafs podcast. So Easton, I keep wanting to call him Easton Stick. I told you I was going to call him Easton Stick about 16 times on this podcast. Easton Stick is a former NFL draft pick, a quarterback. I think he was drafted by like the Chargers, and then he was with Philly. Anyways, anytime he's the only other person who I've heard of that's name was Easton. So that's always going to be in my mind. But it's Easton Cowan is the Leafs' first rounder from this year. But there were 31 other players who got drafted into the NHL tonight. So why don't we talk about the best of the rest? A chalk pick at number 1, obviously, with generational superstar Connor Bedard going to the Chicago Blackhawks. He'll immediately change the direction of that franchise. I got to tell you, Dave, I know Kyle Davidson, very modest guy, only thinks he's about a 4 out of 10, I think he said, in hockey knowledge. I'd say that was a 10 out of 10 pick by Mr. Kyle Davidson.
It's almost like it fell into their lap. I don't know how they managed
Almost,
to do that. How they
almost
pulled that
like
off.
it. What a like you saw that video. I know
Oh
you
yeah,
saw that video.
I shook my head. Like I can understand if you're just not someone who watches Kyle Davidson on a day-to-day basis, can see how that may have confused, like just not oblivious to who he was.
Dude, I'd be honest with you. I would imagine that more than 80% of hockey fans couldn't pick Kyle Davidson out of a crowd.
No,
I wouldn't even
I,
like legitimately. I mean, man, I'm even lowballing it. If you put 100 people in a room, right, and Kyle Davidson was one of them, and you brought in 1,000 hockey fans, maybe 4 of them could pick him out. I
yes,
swear that
I
maybe.
I'll be honest. I wouldn't have recognized him at first. It would have taken me a minute because I don't see Kyle Davidson that often.
Exactly. Unless you're in Chicago, different
Yeah,
story. Like, you're just not gonna really know the guy. He's just a young dude. You think he maybe is a player. Like, at
yeah.
that like, he's still young enough where he could be playing in the NHL at 34. But it was a really funny video. If you guys, haven't seen it, you don't know what we're talking about. There was, somebody out there, I can't remember what the publication was, but they were doing some online videos and just some fun content, and they interviewed, guys on the street, and one of the guys who they interviewed happened to be Kyle Davidson, the general manager of the Chicago Blackhawks, and they didn't know it was Kyle Davidson. Just thought he was Kyle from Chicago because that's how he introduced himself. And they're asking him all these hockey questions, and it was funny too. And they're like, "Do you think that the NHL rigged it for the Blackhawks to get number one so they can get Connor Bedard?" And he's like, no, I don't." And he's like, "You sound confident." He's like, "Yeah, pretty confident in that."
I honestly, I would have said no, and I would have done the wink.
That would have been
I
funny.
would have played with that so much.
That would have been pretty funny. We didn't have to wait long after the Connor Bedard pick to be shocked because Leo Carlson ends up going to number 2 to Anaheim. They go with Leo Carlson out of Sweden over the Toronto boy, Adam Fantilli. How big of a surprise was that?
Obviously surprised because I said it was going to be Adam Fantilli second.
We both did. Everyone did.
That-
Legitimately, everybody thought that it was going to be pretty chalky top 3 picks. Bedard, Fantilli, Leo Carlson, and the draft was kind of going to start at 4. And then, nope, Leo Carlson goes number 2, and Adam Fantilli falls to Columbus at 3.
But funny enough, a friend of mine mentioned early in the day that he was on FanDuel. And he noticed the odds
Very shifting.
started to shift,
Yeah.
where Fantilli was still favored, but not in the way he was, a few like even the day before. And Carlson his odds started to improve a little bit more.
Yeah, Fantilli was like minus 700 yesterday when we were doing the podcast, and we were just kind of looking at him on FanDuel. And yeah, they started to drop a little bit. All of these numbers started to drop. You should have stuck with at 5 when you thought, man, maybe they go defenseman. They did end up going with the defenseman. With Reinbacher. I don't know. I'm gonna pull a Carey Price right
Well, you
now.
mean David?
Yeah, exactly. No one helped him either. Like, come
I'm
on.
like, oh,
Sitting there, it's like, guys,
give him something to read off of.
well,
What are
that
we
too.
doing here, people?
That too. And then Pecorina has the exact same situation. He
Yeah.
caught himself eventually,
Yes.
but almost the same problem. I'm like, oh, this is a bad look for attendees, man. A bad look for goalies. They're out here trying to announce picks and they keep forgetting the players' names. It's
Oh
like,
my
oh
god,
man. But that Carey Price one, that might be an all-time like
that's an all
worst.
timer.
Like that's honestly might be the worst situation because
It's not like
this is
Bobby
like,
Clark when he's just like, who? Oh yeah, Claude Giroux, and it's just
yeah, exactly.
that
Where it
was
was
the
only
worst
like
one.
he forgot the name, but then they were like, "Oh," it was like, "Oh yeah," it was like a second later. This guy's sitting here for like 6, 7, 8 seconds of silence, and no one's saying anything to the guy. He's looking back, being like, "Anyone want to help me out here?" What was the name again? And then eventually, Ken Hughes just like David Reinbacher.
Just as we planned it. I'm like, shut up.
Yeah, ain't nobody planning that. That was not planned, but that was kind of funny.
It did
Uh,
add to the rage of Habs fans though, who did not like that pick at all. Like quite a few were not happy with that one.
no, did you see some discourse online about it?
Oh, I saw some discourse online. It's, I mean, it doesn't help when your goaltender fumbles the pick, and then people just like but like, what is like? He doesn't move the needle in the way that I think the Habs were hoping.
Maybe Carey Price was giving them a chance to change the pick.
Yeah,
He was
got.
like, "I'm gonna give you guys another 8 seconds here so you can
Is there
change
another
your mind."
David we can? Is there another David we can throw out there?
Like, can we just scrap the David, pretend I didn't say that? I'm being silent. People can forget. They're like goldfish after
I
6
said the
seconds.
wrong name.
Matvey Michkov actually is gonna be our selection. Imagine.
Anybody else at that point, I think, is what the Habs fans were looking for there.
Yeah, you know what it is though. Like if you look at the Habs, they don't have a lot of right-handed defensemen in their system, so I guess it makes sense. It was a kind of a needs-based pick. I mean, the guy was still like supposed to be a top half of the first round. Was he supposed to be fifth overall? Probably not. But neither was Simashev, who went sixth overall either to the Arizona Coyotes at six. And that pick was probably the biggest head scratcher of the night up until the Maple Leafs made their pick, where then it was like, okay, this one's the biggest reach of the evening. We brought up Matvey Michkov. We were curious as to where he was going to go because of the whole situation. Like, based on talent, he probably was the second best player in the draft based off of talent. But weird situation with Michkov where he is under contract with Lokomotiv in the KHL for another 3 years. So it'll be 3 years before he can come over to North America, unless something happens and he is able to get out of that
Mhm.
contract. That's the expectation. And most likely the teams who were picking ahead of him didn't want to wait those years. Plus, they also won't have much of say in terms of development when he's in the
Right.
KHL, and sometimes things could go a little awry. And that's why we see Russian prospects fall sometimes. And that happened with Michkov, but the fall stopped at seventh overall, ends up with the Philadelphia Flyers. Pretty good pick and a steal at that point for the Philadelphia Flyers. One ahead of Washington, by the way. And I was so mad because I wanted Washington to get this guy to pair him up with Ovechkin, because Ovechkin could have called up Putin and said, "Get this guy out of the contract now," and maybe we could have seen Michkov a lot sooner. And all they had to do was flip with the Yotes, just move up 2 picks to six overall, take Michkov, and then who knows how the draft unfolds after that. I guarantee you that defenseman still would have been there for the Yotes at 8 if they wanted to do that. But they didn't make the pick, and he ends up in Philly. But I think it's a great pickup for the Flyers.
Yeah, no, I mean it's Daniel Briere said after the draft like they don't have a player like that in their organization.
Not
Like
many do, man. Like this
no.
kid is honestly uber talented. Like he's not he based off pure talent should have been the second overall pick in this draft, but because of the situation that he's in,
Yeah.
falls to seven. So yeah, he's going to be a hell of a pick and a hell of a player for them. We'll see how long before he gets over into North America and could do it. Might not be until he's 22, 23 years old. But we'll see. We'll see how that kind of all unfolds. Any other picks or anything else kind of stick out to you throughout the rest of the draft?
Well, I'll say this. This is the first time since 2007 that there was not a single trade completed in the first round. Shame
Yeah.
on you, NHL general managers. But I will say thank you to the Arizona Coyotes for giving me the entertainment that I needed for tonight
Dude,
because
what were those suits all about, man?
three things. The suits, I will give them credit that they all bought into that and they all wore it proudly. I'll give them credit for that. Two, did they only scout one team in Russia, and that's why they just went to Yugoslavia both times with
Maybe.
with their first picks? And yeah, like the fact that the guy who was picked sixth overall was surprised to be picked sixth overall should probably say something about the guy you picked sixth overall.
Yeah, he was like hands covered his mouth, and he's like, "Oh my god, I'm at six. What me? There's this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy. All like me." I think he was ranked as like the 20th best prospect in the draft, and he ends up going sixth overall to the Arizona Coyotes. Yeah, they were doing some interesting things tonight. Yeah, you're right. That was even Danil Butt when they took or Boot, however it's pronounced. Even that seemed like a little bit of a stretch at that point in time. There were a lot of really talented players that were still available for them. I think Zach Benson was still out there
Yeah.
potentially for them to go out and grab and add a significant player up front. But they decided to go with the bigger player in Danil Boot, and Benson ends up falling to Buffalo at 13. That was a good pick. That was a really good pick. I like Benson a lot. I think that he's going to be
Yeah.
a solid player. He reconnects with his Winnipeg Ice teammate in Matthew Savoy out in Buffalo also. So I think there's going to be some good things happening in Buffalo. They're stocking up that system really really well, and we'll see if they end up making a move for a goaltender at some point here. It's interesting now that the first round is over and all those first round picks were just used up to take players. How much is that going to change the market? And our team's going to be as willing to move second rounders, and our team's
Mm.
going to be wanting second round picks as well. I'll be curious to see if we get more movement on day two, and if we see a lot more trades happen, in the first half of the second round for some of these guys who have kind of spilled over into round two. Now I'm thinking of Haight, Andrew Cristal, Gavin Brindley, Gauthier still out there. There's that goaltender. There's a couple defensemen as well. I think that there could be, a lot of people trying to move back in and get another top 40 pick to try and get some of these sliders. And could that mean that some player movement could end up happening early on tomorrow when things start? I think that's pretty likely.
Yeah, I think so. I think the first round is always like a tough one because some teams like are really sticklers on trying to stay where they are unless they get a offer that blows them away. They're not going to really do anything. Second round, it's a little more of a relaxed sort of day in my opinion, and GMs feel the need to really just. There's been some crazy things that happen on day two of the NHL draft, so it wouldn't surprise me if we see some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I just got a text back from one of the trusted people that I asked about their thoughts on the Cowan selection, and all I got back was a yikes. It was a yikes. So it looks like this individual wasn't particularly pleased with that selection. And I'm sure it's very much based on the fact that it was just a little early. Not that it's a bad player or
Yeah.
that he can't turn into a good player, but it's like, okay, there's a high floor, or there's a high ceiling, but not sure the floor is all that high. And we'll see what ends up happening with Easton Cowan. Anything else that I wanted to quickly bring up here about Easton Cowan or about the NHL draft before we move on to the Kampf and Holmberg signing? Anything else you wanted to mention?
Damn the San Jose Sharks for taking Quinn Musty. I now have put them back near the top of my hate-o-meter for that
Yeah,
one. St. Louis had a really good draft.
they did. Well, 3 first round picks. You're gonna inject
How many
some
teams
talent
have
into that pool.
Oh yeah, Otto Stenberg, like what a pick that.
That was your
Like
guy. That was your guy. You
that was
wanted
one
him.
of the guys I said if he was there, I would like the Leafs to look at him, and apparently St. Louis had that idea too.
Yeah, yeah, they did. Yeah, overall, congratulations to the 32 young men who are drafted in the first round and, start their journey into the NHL. And there's still over 200 more young men who'll be selected in the second round and beyond. That'll be later today. So, excited to see what else is in store for us in the NHL draft. Leafs with 2 more selections as of now, pick 153. That is in the 5th round, and then pick 185, which is in the 6th round. We'll see if they can add more picks, if they can make a trade for some players, prospects picks. We'll see what happens on day 2 of the NHL draft. We'll take one more quick break. When we get back, David Kampf and Pontus Holmberg both re-sign in Toronto. We'll tell you the terms of the deal and our thoughts. We'll do that in just a moment. You'll listen to Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Welcome back into the Locked On Leafs podcast. I'm Mike DiStefano and Dave Morassutti. So Toronto on draft day didn't make a trade, but they did make a couple of signings. Our first UFA signing, actually, or re-signing rather, for Brad Treliving, and it's none other than David Kampf. Signs a 4-year deal, Dave, at 2.4 million, not 2.5, 2.4 million AAV. Your thoughts on that one, buddy?
And wasn't surprised to see that David Camp was coming back. I thought out of all the free agents, it seemed like they were really trying to get that one back, try to get him to come back. The 4 years is what what caught me off guard to with that. But here's the thing: it's clear they didn't want to let David Camp go. And if you're going to try to keep a player from testing free agency, you got to blow them away with an offer. And that's exactly, I think, what the Leafs did here. They didn't underpay. Did they overpay? I'd probably say slightly overpaid, but you know what you're getting with David Camp each and every day, right? He's been he's been the most durable player the Leafs have had the last few years. So,
He's
um,
played legitimately. He's played every single game for the Maple Leafs since becoming a Maple Leaf. Every single game. I think he might be the only player. Him and maybe Kerfoot might be in that situation last 2 years as well. But extremely durable player.
yeah, was you bringing up Kerfoot's name? I heard that that might still be a possibility. Oh,
I can't believe that's true. I really can't
like,
believe that's a true report that they're interested in bringing back Alex Kerfoot. I just don't want to believe it. I
I
don't.
don't either.
I really don't. But anyway.
But I like there. He's still a very valuable player for this Leafs team. If you watch the playoffs, he was a very underrated player for this Leafs team because
Agreed.
he everyone says he's a fourth line center. He's also a fourth line center that the Leafs had no problem sending out to play against the top line of the Tampa Bay Lightning.
That's right.
Like that's not your typical fourth liner because a lot of teams try to shelter their fourth lines and wouldn't think about putting them against other teams' top lines unless they got caught in an icing situation or something like that. So I'm like I understand that it's a expensive contract for a David Camp like player, but I also see the value in David Camp and on what he has done and what I think. And look, he's 28, right? Like
Yeah, 20 or 27. Yeah.
he's 28. He's
Still
not
in
he's
still in his prime.
Yeah, he's gonna be 32 by the time the deal's done. I will take that for a David Camp, right? And you know what and again, you know what you're getting from him, right? And I think some are saying he has no offensive game. I think that's a little unfair considering he's not asked to be an offensive player. But I've seen him drive offense. He's a good player off the rush. So I think some people might be overreacting a little bit with this deal. It's a little expensive. They didn't get a bargain from him, but I still think it was a worthwhile guy to bring back.
And we think like, man, he's been such a good value contract the last 2 years. So for them to maybe give them an extra, two, three, maybe an extra $400,000 on the contract. I mean, he's been a soldier for you the last couple of years at an immense value. So giving him if you're really stuck and you were haggling over a couple 100,000, whatever, give him the money. And yeah, is it a little bit overpay? Potentially. But I'll tell you some of the guys who are in and around that contract. Like that's the NHL is weird. Like at one point, 2.5 million bucks, maybe that would have been an overpay for a bottom six player, but not really anymore because the cap keeps raising. I know we've been at flat cap for a couple
Yeah.
of years, but it still is about what good third slash fourth line centers go for. I'm going to give you some names, and you tell me who would you prefer, Camp or this player? Okay, Camp or Zemgus Girgensons?
Oh, Camp 100%.
Right. Gergenson's had 10 goals this year, 18 points in 80 games. You had Camp, he had 26 points. He had 11, or 27 points rather. So he ended up with more points in less games. And Zemgus Gergensons makes $2.5 million, 2.5. Camp for Sean Corrali.
I would still say David Camp.
Right. Sean Corrali had 20 points this year. Again, Camp, 27 points, Sean Crowley makes $2.5 million and for whatever reason has a modified no trade clause. Not quite sure why Columbus gave him a modified no trade, but he has one. All right, here's another one for you. Kampf or Casey Cizikas?
I would actually lean towards Casey Cizikas. I think he's a really good, like he's like, if you're looking for that bottom six centerman, Casey Cizikas is like top of the list for a lot of people.
Casey Cizikas is a good player. I think they're in terms of value, maybe they are quite
They're
even,
equal.
but
Yeah.
Casey Cizikas, 32 years old. Casey Cizikas had only 6 goals and 21 points last year, and Casey Cizikas makes more money than David Kampf at $2.5 million AAV. So, 32 years old compared to your 28-year-old, I don't know. I would rather David Kampf, to
I
be
mean,
quite honest with you.
I didn't even realize that Casey Cizikas was 32 years old. So I think he was 30 when he signed that contract, but it was also a
Yeah,
6-year
probably.
contract.
Yeah.
I don't know how he managed to get himself a 6-year contract. Good for Casey Cizikas.
Yeah, exactly. So those are the centermen that are making $2.5 million, which is basically what Camp is making. He's making 2.4. So that's about the value and the rate of a player of David Camp's talent, where he's like a 3.5, we'll call him. Like he can play very competent third line center minutes, or he could be one of the best fourth line centers in the NHL. It's almost like he's a 3B center in a way. He'll go 1A, 1B center, right? He's a 3B, we'll call him. And that's about the going rate for a guy like David Kampf, who's a terrific penalty killer. He's really strong on the faceoffs. He's extremely reliable defensively. He has the trust of Coach Sheldon Keefe, and he's just an overall good dude in the locker room. Also, people always talk about how good of a guy Kampf is in the locker room. So I'm not surprised that they decided to give him the money, lock him up. Maybe 4 years is a little bit longer than we thought it'd be, but I still think that it's a worthwhile deal to get this one done. So he didn't test free agency. Like if it was 3 years, 2.5 per year, or if it was or if he said I want a 4th year and I'll come back, or I'm going to test free agency if you only want to do 3 years. So I said, all right, we'll give you the extra year and you come back. Maybe that's what happened. The one thing that I will say, and this is where I completely somewhat go against everything that I just talked about. And this is where I look at that deal, and as a standalone contract, I like it. It's a good one. It's about the value of what a player of Camp's ilk is worth. But you look at what they could have had for similar prices in the last week. Ryan Johansson is only at a $4 million cap hit for Colorado for the next 2 years. So that's an extra $1.5 million that they would have had to pony up, and they could have had Johansson over Kampf. Or for only like $1 million extra, they could have had Kevin Hayes. So that puts it into a little bit more perspective. Whereas if Brad Treliving was as active on the market and was as aggressive on these players, perhaps they could have had an upgrade on David Kampf for 1 or 1.5 million more, but would have had a significantly better player than what Kampf could bring. That's the only, that's the counter argument, I suppose, is when you look at the trade market and what salary retention, what was seen in the last week. That's where you wonder, maybe should have went this direction. But as a standalone deal, I think that it's about right. A tad high, but it's about right.
Yeah, no, I think it's like it's what's coming next for the Leafs that I'm like really wondering how we're seeing Sheldon Keefe get his guys back a little bit here, and I'm just a little concerned of how much input maybe Sheldon Keefe is having in bringing guys back, and I'm just like, let's just not completely run this back. Like, please, like there has to be some sort of change, otherwise you're just going to lose. We're setting ourselves up potentially for the same thing happening again. But yeah, I think there's going to be opportunities. I think over the next few days, teams are going to want to figure out ways to make deals ahead of free agency, because free agency doesn't have a lot to offer.
No, they have a lot of high end
Yeah.
players to offer, and even with Barbashev re-signing in Vegas today, he was going to be one of the more highly sought after free agents. He's off the market even,
Yeah.
so there's not a whole lot of high end talent, right? There is a lot of depth talent that could be had, and that's really what the Leafs need is a bunch of guys on their third and fourth line because they only have what is it? I think 8 NHLers signed, 8 forwards signed, so they've got a couple more that they need to kind of fit in there. And I'm sure guys like Bobby McMahon and Pontus Holmberg, who signed as well, 2 years at $800,000, will also kind of play into that bottom six this season as well. But yeah, that's probably where you'll see a little bit more change would be in the bottom six this year, and then on the blue line, I would say. Quickly on Holmberg though, 2 years, 800,000 to re-sign him. Yeah, what'd you make of that one? Pretty good.
I liked it. Like, he's a guy I want to see in the NHL next year. You're not going to pay. I didn't expect him to command more than that. So good to make sure you bring him back, and you got him for 2 years. So it's now up to him to see what role he can carve out. So I'm curious to see how that all plays.
Yeah, I thought maybe like if Camp was going to move on, that Holmberg could maybe be Camp's
Mhm.
replacement this season as the fourth line center. So now that just keeps adding to the depth where it's like, okay, if they don't get a third line center, Camp is your third line guy, and then Holmberg is your fourth line guy. But if they do find someone who can play third line center that they like, who's got a little bit more offense to them, if they want to have a top nine this year, then Camp will play fourth, and Pontus Holmberg, could go down in the Marlies because he doesn't require waivers and round out his game a little bit. Like he's still only what a year into North American hockey. Like he played in the SHL his entire junior career, and early on he only came to the AHL I think at the end of like last season, and then he played all of this year. Split between the Marlies and the Leafs this season. 5 goals at the NHL level in 37 games. Had 22 points, or 13 points rather in 37 games, and then had 22 points in 38 games in the AHL. But did have a really strong playoffs. 6 goals in 7 AHL playoff games with the Marlies. So, he's a player just 23 years old that I believe will be kind of a fixture for the next few years. One of those guys who will graduate and become a full time Maple Leaf in the next couple seasons. I think that next year having that because it's a 2 year deal, having him at 800,000 for next season, I think is going to be a big time boon for them in the way that David Kampf was this year, who was making what was he making 900 or 950 or something like that this year. So I think it was a really good pickup, a really good re-sign. And to get that second year also was nice. Good value. Good value, I think. All right, Dave. Long show, but again, this is there's a lot of stuff happening in the NHL and with the Toronto Maple Leafs. They have 2 more draft selections to add to that prospect pipeline later on today. At this point, pick 153 and 185. We'll see if they make any other trades or any other moves. Between now and then to either collect more picks or maybe deal some away, pick up some prospects, some roster players. We'll see what happens. Day 2 of the draft coming up at this point, mere hours away from day 2 and round 2 starting. So enjoy it, ladies and gentlemen. We will recap the second round and kind of recap the entire draft. And then we'll start looking into free agency as well, as we are now 2 days away from free agency. It's coming lightning quick at this point. It's crazy. It's wild. But this is the best time to be a hockey fan. Lots of stuff going on. All right, Dave. Good stuff, buddy. Lots of fun chatting. We'll get back at it tomorrow. That'll do it for us here today on the podcast. I'd like to thank you all for listening and supporting the show. You can subscribe to the Locked On Leafs podcast on all podcasts and platforms, including up on YouTube. You can receive daily Leafs content from us. Follow myself on Twitter at Mickey_Canuck. Follow Dave at D_Morassutti. Follow the show as well at Locked On Leafs. Go ahead, smash that like button if you're watching on YouTube. Go ahead, comment down below too your thoughts on the draft pick made by the Maple Leafs today. What did you make of Easton Cowan as the Leafs' first round selection? Let us know in the comment section down below. We'll be back tomorrow. But until then, get locked right here on Locked On Leafs.